I'm back for part 2 of our post-Tuesday talk, and I've posted a video already to our Blackboard page about a primer on our process, focusing on the tracks of engagement or tracks of exploration. So the next thing I want to do is summarize some of the things that we talked about in class. So one point I made today is that our resources page is something that I will update on a regular basis, and it's going to have really important handouts on it. For this week, there are 2 handouts that I think it's a good idea for you to take a look at, and that's the elements of historical analysis and the Rampolla outcomes. The Rampolla outcomes are going to tell you important takeaways from each chapter, and I have those for the chapter outlines most of the time also, and that's its own link on Blackboard. So listed on those, there's a phrase that says you should be able to, and when you see that, those are the things you should be able to do after you read the chapter. So I think it'll make more sense in just a minute. So today we were talking about the semantics of historical analysis, and we started with Rampolla and Why Study History, Chapter 1. And why does it matter? Well, studying history helps us develop a deeper understanding of ourselves, of how our experience fits into the larger tropes of the American experience or not. It also tells us what's been tried before. If you know what's been attempted before, then hopefully you won't make the same mistakes. So the Why Study History sets a good tone and makes a good argument for why we should all invest ourselves in the study of history. Then we move on to thinking like a historian, asking historical questions and developing important skills of critical analysis. One of the things we talked about earlier is that lots of different disciplines talk about the importance of critical analysis, but history takes the time to break that down and tell you what it is. And that's one of the contributions that studying history will give you. So learning to think like a historian means that we start to recognize that before a history can be written, it has to be discovered. One of the ways I want you to try to think about that is, for a long time, the history of the victors was told. And we've heard this referred to quite frequently, and some of you even posted it in your posts. But in the 1960s, we started to have different people investigating history, becoming historians. So we started to see things like women's history and African American history. We start to see this proliferation of different perspectives in history. And when we have different perspectives, we have a deeper understanding. We understand things better. So before a history can be written, it has to be discovered. And there's a process of that discovery rests upon. Part of that is just intellectual curiosity, asking questions. What do we want to know more about? But also discovering evidence and asking questions of the evidence. And I think the Blue Bottle podcast does a really good job of framing that for you. Evaluating, interpreting, and organizing evidence means that the conclusions you draw are legitimate and that you recognize the value or the significance of that evidence. It's not frivolous, it's useful. But there's an important step in organizing what you found also. It's not just a chronology, although that's part of it. But when we start to organize things maybe by topic or by person, we might start to see things in the evidence that we wouldn't ordinarily see. So sometimes we think like, as a historian, sometimes we think like a detective, sometimes we think like a therapist, sometimes we think like a journalist, And all of these different hats, if you will, mean that we're asking different questions of the evidence, and then organizing that evidence in different ways means that we might see things that we wouldn't ordinarily see. Writing history, the act of crafting a narrative, begins by thinking like a historian, and through the process we discover the complexity of that story. So in taking time to develop certain hallmarks of analytical writing, we ensure we understand it. So some of what that means is we set the context. We're taking the time to explain the circumstances and the environment. If history were a play, context is the set or the backdrop. In developing the context, we're also laying a framework to understand what change occurs. And in order to understand change, we need to establish the continuity, the way things were the same. History happens when things change, so context, continuity, and change are all very closely related. But so too is causation. Causation is tricky because historians recognize that change is complex, and there are many causes that become more clear as we develop the context and the narrative. But when something is reduced to a simple cause and effect relationship, that's a signal that something is missing. We need to dig deeper. We need to better understand it. Okay, folks. Remember, on our resources page, you'll find handouts about the Rampolla You Should Be Able To's, the outcomes, but also the elements of historical analysis. And I think you'll find both of those useful. I had hoped to talk about sources, but we've already hit the 7-minute point, so I'm going to go ahead and wrap this up, and apparently we will have 3 videos for Tuesday's summary. Thank you.